we started discussing the necessary conditions for a deadlock to occur, and we have said that there are four necessary conditions. The first necessary condition is mutual exclusion. That is, there must be at least one resource in the system which cannot be shared simultaneously by more than one process. The second necessary condition that we have said is hold and wait condition. Hold and wait. That is, the processes request for additional resource while holding other resources. If this condition is true in a system, then this can also lead to the occurrence of deadlock. Third condition we have said is no preemption. That is, once a resource is allocated to a particular process, that resource cannot be preempted. The process has to voluntarily release the resource on completion. And the fourth necessary condition that we have said is circular wait, and we have mentioned that circular wait is nothing but an extension of hold and wait, but it is better to have this as a separate condition that helps in analysis of the deadlock problems. So if all these four conditions exist simultaneously in a system, then the system may lead to deadlock. However, if we can ensure that if at least one of them is not present in the system, then the system will not be in deadlock. And there is a nice example which illustrates the existence of all these four conditions, and we can have a deadlock situation is like this. Suppose we have four roads like this. So these are four roads, and these are the junctions. And in every road, the traffic can move only in one direction. So if I say that this is the north, okay, in this road, suppose traffic can move only in the north direction. Here the traffic can move only in the south direction. Here traffic can move only in the east direction, and here the traffic can move only in the west direction. Okay. So if we have a situation like this, the cars are moving over all these roads, and at a particular point of time, we have this kind of situation. So I have a situation like this. And our assumption is, on each of these junctions, only a car in one direction can move at a time. Okay. So if a car is moving in the south direction on this junction, no other car in the east direction can move. So this is a perfect example of a deadlock. So here you find that cars have queued up to this point, and beyond this it finds that this junction is occupied by the traffic moving in the west direction. And this traffic has come up to this point when it finds that this junction is again occupied by the cars moving in the north direction. And here, these cars have also come up to this point, and it finds that this junction is occupied by the traffic moving in the east direction, and this traffic also cannot be cleared because this junction is occupied by the cars moving in the south direction. Okay. So now we find that here no traffic can move in any of the directions, and that is a perfect example of a deadlock. Now let us see whether all these four conditions exist in this particular case or not. Okay. And if I can remove any of these conditions, then whether we are able to avoid the deadlock. Okay. So here you find that I have said that our basic assumption is each of these junctions, because here the resources are the junctions which the traffic in different directions will utilize. So on each of these junctions, traffic can move only in one direction at a time. I cannot have traffic moving in both the directions. So here I cannot have traffic moving in the east direction and traffic moving in the south direction simultaneously. That means the use of these junctions are mutually exclusive. Okay. So this mutual exclusion is present in this example. Whether the next condition, that is hold and wait, is also true. You find that if I consider traffic in any direction, suppose the traffic moving in the south direction, this is holding this junction and waiting for this junction to be free. Okay. Similarly, the traffic moving in the west direction is holding this junction and waiting for this junction to be free. Traffic moving in this direction is holding this junction, waiting for this junction to be free. Similarly, the traffic moving in this direction is holding this junction and waiting for this junction to be free. So this hold and wait condition is also true in this example. Okay. Then no preemption. Once a car has occupied this, the car can voluntarily release this particular junction. Okay. I cannot forcibly remove the car from that point. So no preemption is also true. Then circular wait, as I said, that circular wait is nothing but an extension of hold and wait. Here, every traffic moving in some direction is waiting for the other one to be free, and this is circular in nature. Here, this traffic is holding this, waiting for this to be free. This is holding this, waiting for this to be free. This traffic is holding this, waiting for this to be free. This traffic is holding this and waiting this to be free. And you find that this hold and wait condition leads to a circular wait condition. So all these four conditions are present in this particular example, and here it shows that I can have a situation that where I will have a deadlock. However, it is not necessary that existence of all these four conditions means there will always be a deadlock, but it says that there can be a deadlock. Okay. Now in this, as I said, that if I can remove any of these conditions, then I can break deadlock. How? For example, mutual exclusion. As I said, that use of each of these junctions is mutually exclusive. However, what I can do is, if I simply make a flyover at this junction, in that case what I have, the traffic need not take this junction, however it can take this flyover and move. Okay. So that I can do on each of these junctions, in which case I will never have a deadlock. Okay. So if I remove this mutual exclusion, deadlock will never occur. Similarly, if I can avoid hold and wait, how I can do it? If I take this traffic, why it has led to deadlock? Because it is holding this junction and waiting for this junction to be free. Instead of doing this, if I impose a condition that this traffic can hold this junction only when this junction is free, otherwise it cannot hold this junction. That means before entering this part of the road, it will check whether this junction is free or not. If this junction is free, then only the car can enter this road. And if I impose that condition, in that case, this hold and wait will be broken. And I will never have a deadlock. Okay. How can I avoid no preemption condition? If I find that a particular traffic is holding a particular junction, a particular resource, I can simply bring a crane, lift up that particular car and throw it away. So what you are doing is you are forcibly making that particular resource free. That is, you are preempting the resource from the traffic which is holding it. Okay. And if I do that, a junction becomes free, then all this traffic can move, this will become free, all of them can move, this will become free, all of them can move, this will become free, all of them can move. Okay. So by removing this no preemption condition, again I can break the deadlock. And similarly, this circular weight. Obviously, if I can break this hold and wait, circular weight can also be broken. Okay. So this is a nice example which shows existence of all the four conditions and how that can lead to a deadlock. Okay. Now for this deadlock discussion, we'll assume that our system consists of finite number of resources we'll also assume that the resources can be grouped into various types. Okay. So I can have various types of resources. Okay. And also we assume that every resource type can contain a number of identical resources, okay, which we'll call as instances of that particular resource type. So for example, a system can have say 5 printers, and if all the 5 printers are identical, I'll put them as a printer type having 5 number of instances of that particular printer. Okay. And when I say that a resource type contains a number of identical resources, if a process requests for an instance of a resource type, out of those 5 or 6 instances, allocation of any instance will meet the requirement of the process. Okay. So if a process wants to get some printout, wants to take some printout, out of the 5 printers that are available in the system, any of the printers, if allocated to the process, that will meet the requirement of the process. Okay. So in a system, we'll have finite number of resources. Then the resources can be grouped into various types. Every type will have a number of instances of that resource. Every type has a number of identical instances. Okay. So this is our assumption. That means in a system, we have a number of processes, we have finite number of resources, the resources are grouped into various types of resources, every type has a number of identical resource instances. Okay. Now this deadlock can be very easily described with the help of graphical technique. As you all know that a graph is represented by a pair, the pair is V and E, where V is the set of vertices in the graph and E is the set of edges in the graph. Okay. Now the vertices in this case will be of two types. We'll have some vertices which represent the processes in the system, and we'll have some other vertices which will represent the resource types in the system. Okay. So a vertex corresponding to a process will represent that by a circle, and a vertex corresponding to a resource type will be represented by a rectangle, and within the rectangle we'll put a number of dots which is equal to the number of instances of that resource type. So if a particular resource type has got say 3 identical instances of that resource, we will put 3 dots in the rectangle. Okay. Similarly, for edges, we will have 2 kinds of edges. One we will call as request edge, that is whenever a process requests for a resource, we will make a request edge. Okay. And a request edge is of the form a process Pi requesting for a resource type, an instance of resource type Rj. So we make an request edge starting from process Pi to resource type Rj. Okay. So if this represents the process Ti, as I said, that every process will be represented by a vertex, and that representation is with the help of a circle, and every resource type will be represented by a rectangle. So this is a vertex corresponding to the resource type Rj, and if this Rj contains say 2 resource instances, then we'll have 2 dots within this rectangle. And whenever process Pi puts a request for a resource type Rj, an instance of resource type Rj, then we'll have a request edge from Pi to Rj. Now, since Pi has put a request of Rj and our assumption is all these instances are identical, then when this request is actually met, that is resource instance is actually allocated to the process, then this request edge will be converted to an allocation edge. Okay. So one kind of edge we have is the request edge, and the other kind of edge that we'll have in the graph is called an allocation edge. And obviously, since an allocation edge represents an instance of a resource type which is allocated to the requesting process, so the direction of this arrow will be different. So an allocation edge will be represented by an edge from resource type Rj to the requesting process Pi. So in this case it is Pi Rj, in this case it is Rj Pi. And just having an allocation edge from resource type Rj to process Pi is not sufficient, because when the process has requested for a resource, then it does not know that which of these instances, which of the instances of that resource type will be allocated to the process Pi. But when the allocation is actually made, in that case it is no more indefinite. It is a particular instance which is allocated to the process. Okay. So an allocation edge will appear like this. Say process Pi has requested for an instance of a resource type Rj which contains 2 instances, identical instances of that resource. One of these 2 will be allocated to process Pi. Okay. So when you convert the request edge to the allocation edge, when actually the allocation is made, then the arrow or the edge has to start from a particular instance to the requesting process Pi. Okay. So in the resource, and this graph is called a resource allocation graph. Okay. And we can describe a deadlock situation with the help of resource allocation graph. Now let us take a particular resource allocation graph and see how it leads to the deadlock analysis. situation. So suppose at a particular instant of time in a system we have got three processes, and let us say the processes are P1, P2 and P3. So this is the resource allocation graph that we are discussing. And suppose this system has got four resource types, and those resource types we will put as resource type R1, resource type say R2, resource type R3, and resource type say R4. Let us put it this way. Okay. And we assume that resource type R1 has got a single instance of that resource. Resource type R3 also has got a single instance of that resource. Resource type R2 may have say two instances of that resource. So I put it as two dots, and say resource type R4 has got three instances of the resource. Okay. Now, at a particular instant of time, let us assume that P1 has put a request for an instance of resource type R1. Okay. And at that time, an instance of resource type R2 is allocated to process P1. Okay. So P1 is holding R2, and while holding R2, it is requesting for instance of resource type R1. Okay. Resource type R1 at that point of time may be actually allocated to process P2, right? And while holding an instance of resource type R1, suppose process P2 has put a request for an instance of resource type R3. Okay. And at the same time, suppose an instance, the second instance of resource type R2 is also allocated to process P2. Right? Now, at this point, maybe because R3 has got a single instance, so this instance of resource type R3 is actually allocated to process P3. So I can have a situation like this, that at particular time, an instance of resource type R3 is allocated to process P3, and P3 is not waiting for any other resource. P2 is holding an instance of resource type R1, an instance of resource type R2, and it is waiting for an instance of resource type R3. P1 is holding an instance of resource type R2, and it is waiting for an instance of resource type R1. Okay. So I can have a situation like this, and through this graph, I can analyze that whether there can be a deadlock or not. Okay. Now, at this point, if I assume that these processes, at least for the time being, does not need any other resource, whatever resources are needed, those are represented with the help of this graph. Okay. So here you find that P3, because it is not waiting for any other resource, so I can assume that this is the only resource that is required by P3 for its completion. So on completion, P3 will release the resource R3, and when it is released, this can be allocated to P2. When it is allocated to P2, now it is the request is from P2 to R3 that will be converted to an allocation edge. Okay. Now coming to P2, you find that P2 requires three resources, one instance of R1, another instance of R2, and an instance of R3, which is also now available. So with the availability of all these three resources, P2 will also complete operation. On completion, P2 will release this instance of R2, also this instance of R1. Okay. So when this instance of R1 is released by P2, it will be allocated to P1. So this request age will be converted to an allocation age. Okay. So when P1 gets this instance of R1, then P1 receives both the resources. It has already acquired R2 and it will acquire R1. Okay. On acquiring both these resources, P1 will also complete. So particularly this situation does not lead to a deadlock. But what happens if we have a situation like this? Suppose at the same time, P3 is also waiting for an instance of resource type R2. Okay. Now find that this situation leads to a deadlock because P3 is waiting for an instance of resource type R2 and both the instances of R2 are already allocated. One of the instances allocated to P2, the other instance is allocated to P1. So none of the instances of R2 is available. So P3 cannot get until and unless these two are released by P1 and P2. Right? P2 in turn is waiting for R3. Until and unless R3 is available, P2 will not complete operation, so it will not release R2. R3 in turn is allocated to P3. So until and unless P3 completes operation, it will not release R3. Coming back to this, the other instance of R2 is allocated to P1. P1 will release this resource only when P1 gets R1 and completes operation. R1 is currently allocated to P2. P2 will not release R1 until and unless it gets R3. Okay. So you find that we have a situation that every process is waiting for some resource which has to be released by some other process, and that in turn is waiting for some other resource to be released by the first process. So we have a perfect situation of deadlock. Okay. So from this resource allocation graph, one point is quite clear, that if in a resource allocation graph we find that there is a cycle, you find that there are two cycles in this graph. One is this, other one is this. Okay. So if there is a cycle in the graph, then there can be a deadlock. Again, I am saying there can be a deadlock. Okay. There may not be a deadlock. Even if there is a cycle in the graph, this may not lead to a deadlock. That is also possible. However, if every resource type contains a single instance of a resource, then existence of a cycle means there is a deadlock. But if the resource types contains multiple instances of the resources, then existence of a cycle means that there may be a deadlock. It does not say that there is a deadlock. Okay. So for example, if I take another resource allocation graph, something like this, say a simple graph. This is resource type R1, this is resource type R2. Suppose this has got two instances, this also has two instances. I have process P1. P1 has put a request for a resource type R1 and it has acquired an instance of resource type R2. Okay. This one may be allocated to another process, say P2. A process P3 has acquired the second instance of R1 and it is waiting for an instance of resource type, say R2. This instance may be allocated to another process, say P4. I can have a situation like this. Okay. So here again you find that there is a cycle. The cycle from P1 to R1 to P3 to R3 to P1. But even in presence of this cycle, this does not lead to a deadlock. Because the processes P2 and P4, though they are holding the resource instances of R1 and R2, but they are not waiting for any other resource. So they will complete their operation, release the resources when these resources can be allocated to the requesting process. Right? So this is an example of a resource allocation graph when even if there is a cycle, but this does not lead to a deadlock. Okay, so what we are saying is the presence of a cycle in a resource allocation graph where every resource type contains multiple instances of the resources, that simply says that that system may lead to a deadlock, but it does not ensure that there will always be a deadlock. However, if every resource type contains single instance of the resource, in that case, existence of a cycle will mean there is always a deadlock. And the reason is obvious, because there are single instances and there is a cycle. So process holding the only instance of the resource that is available and waiting for some other instance to be released, which in turn is held by some other process. So I cannot have this kind of situation that a process which is held by that a resource type instance which is held by some process, it does not wait for any other resources, so it will release it. Okay. So you find that here in this example, if I simply remove these instances, if I remove these instances, then I have a deadlock. Right? So existence of a single instance of resource type indicates that in a resource allocation graph, existence of a cycle means there is a deadlock, but which is not true for multiple instances in different resource types. Okay. So this is a method that we can use for describing deadlocks and to find out whether deadlock has occurred or not. Okay. Now we have to see that how we can deal with the deadlock situations. So there are different approaches in which the deadlock can be managed. One approach is that I will not allocate the resources in such a way so that the system can be in deadlock. Okay. The second approach can be that let the resources be allocated to the requesting processes whenever it is available and the process needs it. But periodically, I will check whether a deadlock has occurred or not, and I will take care of the deadlock situation if there is a deadlock. But as long as I have the resources and the processes are requesting for the resources, I will go on allocating the resources. However, that is a costly approach, because whenever a process goes under deadlock, the only way to come out of the deadlock is to kill the process. And suppose you have a job which may take 5 hours for execution, and after 4 hours 59 minutes you find that the job has gone into deadlock and you terminate it at that point. Okay, so next time you start the job, you have to start it from the beginning. So this entire execution time of 4 hours 59 minutes is wasted. Okay, so it is always better to adopt a strategy to avoid the occurrence of deadlock rather than detect deadlock and break the deadlock. Okay, so we can have 3 different kinds of uh, strategies for dealing with the deadlock. One of them is called deadlock prevention. The second strategy is called deadlock avoidance. And the third strategy to deal with the deadlock is called deadlock detection and recovery. And it is this deadlock detection and recovery which I said that we allow the system to allocate the resources whenever it is available, And periodically I check whether there has been a deadlock or not. If there is a deadlock, you try to break the deadlock. And this is an approach which we don't want to be taken, because this leads to inefficient utilization of resources, and there are a lot of wastes. However, what is preferred is either deadlock prevention or deadlock avoidance. Okay, though these two appear to be the same. In one case, you are preventing the deadlock from occurrence. In other case, you are avoiding the deadlock to be occurred. Okay, so they apparently, these two techniques are same, but there is a difference of approach. The difference is, in case of deadlock, we know that there are a number of resources in the system. The processes requests for those resources whenever they need the resources. Okay. In case of deadlock prevention technique, what is used is you put restriction on the processes in the way they can request for the resources. That means what we try to do is we try to see whether we can break by such restriction one of the four necessary conditions of the deadlock to occur. Okay. That is, you try to break either mutual exclusion, or you try to break hold and wait, or you try to break no preemption, or you try to break the circular wait. Okay. So you try to break one of these four conditions through this deadlock prevention technique. In case of deadlock avoidance, you don't put any restriction on the way in which the processes can request for the resources. We assume that the processes can put the request at any time whenever they need some resource. But the system will decide whether that request will be immediately granted, or the request will be, or the process will be asked to wait for release of some more resources by other processes, and then only the request will be granted. Okay. So in such case, in case of deadlock avoidance algorithm, it may so happen, even if a process asks for, say, 2 instances of a particular resource type, and maybe at that point 3 instances of that resource type is available. Okay. So what is available is more than what is requested by the process. But even then the process may have to wait, because the system will try to analyze that after allocation of those 2 instances, if there is any possibility that the system will enter deadlock. Okay. So it will perform a pre-calculation in background to find out whether this allocation will lead to a deadlock or not. If it leads to a deadlock, then the state of the system is called an unsafe state. So the system will try to see that the system never goes into an unsafe state. Of course, unsafe state does not mean that there will be deadlock. So as in this case, we have seen that whenever there is a circle, this does not mean that there is a deadlock, but there is a possibility that there will be deadlock. So such a kind of situation we'll call as unsafe. Okay. So we should try to see that our allocation should never lead to a cycle, even if that does not lead to a deadlock, but we will try to avoid the cycle. So that is an approach which is taken in case of deadlock avoidance. Okay. Now first, let us see what is deadlock prevention, whether by some means we can break any of the 4 conditions which are responsible for the occurrence of deadlock. So we first consider this deadlock prevention technique. Okay. Now among the 4 conditions, we have said that the first condition for the occurrence of deadlock is mutual exclusion of resources. In a system, there are always some resources which are by nature mutually exclusive. So one of the example I said is the printer. Printer is a resource, but printer cannot be shared by more than one process simultaneously, because in that case I cannot make out that which output has come from which of the process. So there is always some resource in a system which by nature is mutually exclusive. So this condition, it may not be possible to break always. So better don't try to break this. Try to see whether other conditions can be broken or not. The next condition is hold and wait. Let us see whether this hold and wait condition can be broken. Hold and wait says that a process requests for additional resources while holding other resources. So here I can put a restriction that a process can request for a resource only when it is holding none. That means before putting a request for a resource, whatever resource it has already acquired, that has to be released. Okay. It may so happen that the process has not yet finished its work with that particular resource. But even then it has to release and put that resource into the list of resources which will be required by the process in future. Right? So if I put that restriction, in that case, this hold and wait can be avoided. The other approach can be that whatever is the number of resources that the process needs for its completion, it will put request for all those resources at the beginning, acquire all those resources, then only it can start execution. Okay. So if a process requires say 5 resources A, B, C, D, and E, before starting execution, it will put request for all those resources, all those 5 resources. Only when it acquires all those 5 resources, then only the process will start execution, and at the end, it will release all the 5 resources. Okay. So I never have the situation that it is putting a request while holding others. It first gets hold of the resources, then only starts execution. So that also avoids the deadlock. But the problem is inefficient utilization of resources. The process is getting all the 5 resources, but all the 5 resources it won't need all the time. So for example, if the printer is one of the resources, normally we want to have the printout at the end of processing. But at the very beginning, if I hold the printer till end, for most of the time the printer is not utilized. Okay. So this leads to poor utilization of resources, but even then it solves the deadlock problem. Okay. The third condition, that is no preemption. This also can be broken if I follow a approach that whenever a process, say Pi, puts a request for a resource type say Rj, okay, and Rj is currently given to a process say Pj. Okay. So I can have a situation like this, and that is the reason, one of the reasons which leads to deadlock. Right? So here what I can do is, whenever a process Pi puts a request for a resource type Rj, and it is found that Rj is currently allocated to some other process Pj, that means Pi has to wait for Rj. At that point I can take one of the two approaches. If process Pi is holding some resource, we'll ask process Pi to release those resources voluntarily, forcibly. Okay. And that resource which is now released is added to the list of resources which will be requested by Pi in future. Okay. So because Pi has to wait for the release of Rj, I will not allow Pi to hold any resource at this point. However, if Pi is not to wait for this resource Rj, then I don't have any problem. I can immediately allocate it. Okay. So that does not lead to any of this hold and wait condition. But by forcing non-occurrence of no preemption, what I try to do is I try to break this hold and wait condition. By this, whenever Pi puts a request for Rj, it cannot immediately get Rj because Rj is allocated to some other process Pj. We will force Pi to release all the resources which it is holding at this particular instant of time. Okay. The other approach can be, we can ask Pj to release Rj immediately. if Pj is waiting for some other resources. Okay, so I can have a situation like this, that Pi is waiting for Rj, Rj is allocated to process Pj, Pj is in turn waiting for another resource type, say Rk. That means Pj also cannot proceed its execution because Rk is not available. Okay. So at this point, what I can do is, because Pj is also waiting, while holding Rj, we'll ask Pj to release Rj. When Rj can be allocated to Pi and Pi can complete execution. So there are various approaches that can be taken, and this will try to break this no preemption condition. And the fourth condition, that is the circular wait, can be broken if we allow the processes to request for resources in a particular order. So for that, what we do is we define a mapping function. You decide a mapping function, say f, which maps resource types to the set of integers n. That means for every resource type Rj, I have a corresponding integer number. Okay. Now we put a restriction that a process, while holding a resource type Ri, can put a request for another resource type Rj only when f of Rj is greater than f of Ri. So while holding resource type Ri, it can put a request for resource type Rj only when f of Rj is greater than f of Ri. If this condition is not satisfied, then the process cannot put a request for resource type Rj. For that, what it has to do is, before putting a request for resource type Rj, it has to release resource type Ri. Okay. For this, the condition must be true. And next day we'll see that if we impose this condition and put restriction on in the way the resources can be requested, the deadlock can be avoided.